to speak before a group. And it gives me great pleasure when you ask me to come back and speak about John, not so much about the book, Sometimes I Cry in the Shower. Certainly, John facilitated that in my mind as I went through my grieving processes. But to have an opportunity to come out and speak about John, so often, especially early in our grieving processes, we want to kind of hide our pain. And there comes a point where you're going to want to talk about it, and you get concerned about other people who they might be tired of hearing about your story and that loved one that you lost. These groups that come together like this are the most magical things that healing process it can go through because it gives me the opportunity to talk about John. And now it gives me another opportunity, really, as we talk about John, to talk about something. And it's really the book I wrote after Sometimes I Cry in the Shower called The Grief Case. But it gives me that opportunity now to set my grief case in front of you and open it up because inside of what I call a grief case is my life, my love, my joyous feelings about my late son that I am always willing to open up and share with anybody. And you've given me that opportunity tonight, amongst all the other wonderful things you do for those that unfortunately are new or somewhat fresh to this group. Um, the grief case, and before I start talking about John, I will explain that grief case a little bit to you. If you will, grief is not an emotion. If you've lost somebody and somebody asks you how you feel, you're not going to tell them you feel grieved. You're going to tell them you feel sad, you feel hurt, you feel scared, you feel confused. A whole litany of emotions that are inside of you are all carried inside of that word grief. If you think about it, grief is a carrier. Grief is a case. So inside of that case, I have my grief and I call it my grief case. So when I wrote the book in 2015, The Grief Case, I realized that it was part of my healing processes because much like a briefcase, as I open my grief case, it is filled, in my mind, with manila folders full of my emotions. I had a grief case. Anyone that has lost a loved one has got a grief case. It was handed to you, unfortunately, the minute that traumatic event happened. You can't put it down. You can't leave it behind. It has to be with you until you see that lost loved one again. It's heavy. It's burdensome. We don't want to look inside of it, and yet we have to look inside. Sometimes we kind of hold ourselves back from our healing processes because we don't want to go out and socialize because others might see our grief case. We don't want to laugh because the grief case is holding us back and holding us down. There's so much that at first that grief case does to really hinder our entire processes of moving forward. But as you open that grief case, and you must, we all repress our griefs, and in many cases, for a little while, that's kind of normal to repress our grief a little bit. But there comes a time that you're going to have to open that grief case and look inside. And as I said, inside, I had a series of what I pictured as manila folders, and each one of them had an emotion inside of it. I had sadness, I had anger, I had guilt, I had regret, I had remorse, I had confusion, I had shock, I had any number that you could sit and think that you might have yourself. I had all those folders inside, and they were jumbled and confused. They were out of place. Papers were spilling out of one and falling into another. So I decided it was time to sit down and go through those files and take a look at them. And just to point out a few so that we can move on and talk about John, the biggest ones that had the impact on me, the biggest ones that really allowed me to move forward are what I call the anger and guilt folders. Because so often in loss, so often after we've been through a traumatic event, guilt and anger are there. They're natural, they're normal, they're healthy. Anger is healthy. Anger after a loss, anytime someone takes something away from you beyond your control, beyond your consent, you're going to be angry. And there's healthy processing of anger. My gosh, the woman who started, the mother who started Mothers Against Drunk Driving, used her anger in such a powerful, positive way that it literally changed the culture in North America, and in a very brief time. My problem with the folders was I could have relabeled them false anger and false guilt. And they were so jumbled, so mixed up, and so often as I pulled a piece of paper from that file and I looked at it, I realized John passed in a hospital. I was angry, angry at the hospital. John was under the care of some doctors that I had come to know over the years because he had a heart condition. I was angry with them. Gosh, I wanted nothing more than to be angry and to go just express my anger in front of them and tell them how mad I was at the fact that they let my child pass away. Then I realized those were false anchors. And when I realized that, I was able to start removing those papers from my file. I left behind in that file those things that I was truly angry with, and those were healthy, healthy things that I wanted to pursue and use in a positive way. Guilt. We've all felt guilt. Guilt is again, it's natural and normal. Guilt is designed to make us feel bad about something we've done in the past so that we can improve ourselves in the future. But false guilt. After John passed, I thought, my gosh, he had a bad heart. He wasn't supposed to pass, and I'll get into that in a minute. Even though he had a bad heart, his prognosis was for a fairly full life. But did he pass because I didn't let him eat right? Because I allowed him to sneak a snack? Because I allowed him to play couch potato too much? If you read my book, Sometimes I Cry in the Shower, I get into the guilt aspect of it a lot. And you can take yourself back into a spinning maze of confusion just by the guilt. So in my grief case, I was allowed to take that guilt file and pull out the guilt that was false, and to use then the true guilt that was in there to make myself a better person as I moved along. And there were so many files that as I kept going through and realized what needed to stay and what needed to leave and what was redundant and what I'd already seen in another file, I slowly started to notice that my grief case was getting lighter. That as I carried my grief case with me through life, because I had to carry it everywhere, and I still carry it today joyously, as I carried it through life, I was more inclined to go places that I wasn't inclined to go before. I was more inclined to go socialize. I was more inclined to go to the movies, to meet up with others that I knew that we would have a good time without feeling guilty about it. And as I realized it got lighter and lighter, I realized that it was something inside of that grief case. To me, I call it the magic folder. There's a folder in that grief case that you will never lighten, that you will only continue to fill. And that's the one that John gave me that was unconditional love. That will only fill up. That will never go away. The other folder that's in there that we really have to consider is the sadness folder. I don't want that to go anywhere. And I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but if I get rid of the sadness, I'm a monster. I I always want to feel like this when I realize my son is gone. But because of the grief case, I won't let it control my day. I will use those thoughts. And I remember for 16 years, I had unconditional love that has not stopped. One of our biggest fears is that after losing someone we love, we've expressed and we've felt unconditional love. And my gosh, we may never feel that again. And if you think I'm being selfish when I talk about me in this, because my gosh, we do feel so bad for that one that we lost. In my case, a 16-year-old child that missed so much of life. I grieved for him. I hurt for him. I hurt for the fact that he would never experience all those things I'd experienced through my 20s and 30s and 40s. And I'm going to stop right there before I age myself. But I've been through that. I continue to grieve for him for that. But it's okay to hurt for me. My future was taken away. My blueprints for my life were taken from me against my will, against my wishes. And it's okay for you to hurt for yourself. And I hope you do. And I hope when it comes that you feel the hurt and let it make you stronger. So I carry my briefcase. I carry it proudly. And when somebody like Jane asks me if I will come and talk to John, the first thing I will do is throw my briefcase up on this desk in front of me and say, here's John. Let me tell you about him. In 1997, I was 35. I had, I spent the second half of my 20 years of life as an executive in private business. First 20 years I spent as a military policeman in the United States Marine Corps, a sworn police officer in Washington, D.C., and as a federal agent with the U.S. State Department before I decided I might want to settle down. So I didn't have John until I was 35. I'll just leave it in the text of saying I experienced life before I settled in and had a child. And on that joyous day, January 31st, 1997, when John was born, the doctors took him away for a few minutes. A few minutes. They came back in about an hour. And when they walked back in the door, there were 9 of them, all in white lab coats. And they came up to me and they said, your child probably will not make it through the first night of his life. Grief right there. Didn't know how to handle it. Cut forward, though, we ended up with John certainly surviving the first night of his life. We ended up at Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and by the time we had followed the ambulance there were a team of physicians, pediatric cardiothoracic physicians, that were just surrounding John on a table. One walked over to me and he said, we think we can help him. My life changed. Unfortunately, John had a rare blood type, which meant he was never going to experience a heart transplant. But unfortunately, he had been born with a condition called hypoplastic left heart syndrome, which in short means the left side of his heart had failed to grow in the womb, and he only had the right 2 chambers. Without a heart transplant, they wanted to do something experimental, and that was to create a 2-chambered heart that would fully function for him. And I say fully, there were going to be limitations if he survived the traumatic open heart surgeries, 3 of them before he was even a year and a half of age. And he did. And he had a heart that functioned on 2 chambers. He would never be able to play physical sports so much because technically his heart could not process the amount of oxygen that you and I have. His oxygen saturations were always going to be low. As he grew up, we knew that there were going to be medical interventions. And some might say, you had a child who had a condition where he could pass away at any time. Didn't you kind of accept that in your heart? Well, number one, even if you have a loved one who is terminal, you will pray to the very end that there will be some miracle, some happening somehow that that person will survive. With John, though, and I want to bring this up because when we are in these deep emotional situations, what we tell ourselves now can have a deep impact on us in the future. And it's kind of a story I have to go back to the age of 4, and I'll make this quick. But at the age of 4, in the United States, if you had a sore throat, they just pulled your tonsils out. Plain and simple. They were going to pull your tonsils out. You'll know where I'm going with this in just a second. But I had a tonsillectomy at the age of 4. I was taken to a hospital. It was very traumatic. I was scared to death. I was 4 years old. Mom and dad are there, but if you can imagine a hospital in the mid 60s, it wasn't what a hospital is today. But at 10 o'clock at night, I do remember the doctor coming in and him leaning down over my bed, because in those days they allowed you to go to sleep the night before. Sometime during the night, they would administer gas to knock you out, then they would perform the procedure, so you never really even knew what was happening. But he leaned down into my bed. He said, I understand that you have a sore throat. He said, I'm going to make it so that you never have a sore throat again. My traumatized mind embedded that inside of me. And I will tell you right now, I have never had a sore throat in my life. I have had pneumonia. I have had flus. I have had everything that we all get, sans the sore throat. Because somebody in a traumatized, while I was in a traumatized state, put that in my head. Flash forward to John's 3rd and final open heart surgery, initial open heart. After that, with the medical interventions, he would have a total of 7 open heart surgeries during his life. But after that initial 3 open heart surgeries where they rebuilt his heart, his pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon came to me and he said, I think we've done it. I expect John to have a full life. And I was traumatized, but in my mind, he said that. Now, he said, of course, there are going to be medical interventions. There are things that we rebuilt in his heart that just are not going to grow with him. And we're going to have to go back in and change some things as we go along, but we think he's going to have a full life. I accepted that. That was so emblazoned in my brain right then and there that my son survived. And for lack of all the other traumas that we would go through in life, his heart was never going to be his demise. That was always going to be taken care of. We went through an amazing life. We went through a lot of surgeries, but a lot of them were pacemaker changes. A lot of them were ENT, where we had his tonsils and adenoids pulled out. We went through what every parent would want to go through, with trips back and forth, medical interventions, heart catheterizations just to go and see what's going on so we could see what was coming in the future for John, what was getting too small. Did we need to open up a blood vessel here and add another one there? He wasn't supposed to die. We went in for a routine heart catheterization. John had had 3, 4 of them. He was 16 years of age. He was actually, because he couldn't play contact sports, I had bought him a set of golf clubs early. He was actually the first freshman in his high school to ever make the golf team. And that was his pride and joy, being able to golf. So we went in for a heart cath. He came out of the heart cath and went into recovery. Heart cath went well. For some reason, his heart crashed while he was in recovery. And try as they might, the attending physicians were not able to recover John. I was despondent, like any parent would be. I won't go through what the next couple of days were like, but it left me with that feeling initially that he was an only child. Was I even a father anymore? I'd lost an identity. Yes, I'd lost a son. And let's go back and talk about it. I grieved and hurt for my son and what he would miss in life. But I hurt for me, and I allowed myself to hurt for me. But for a while there, it took me backwards. I'm hurting because I had to think, was I a parent? What kind of a parent was I? I allowed my child to pass away. And now that he's gone, was I a father anymore? This carried on for about 6 months. And I'll tell you this, and whether it was, some bad food that I ate or some weird synapses contact in my brain, I was in the shower one morning and John came to my mind. And then I heard him plain as day. And he said, how dare you, Dad? How dare you not grieve me? He said, how dare you not think you're my father anymore? Just like that, he was gone. I don't know what it was. Like I said, bad pizza, bad piece of pepperoni the night before. But I had heard it, and it changed my life. And it changed how I looked at what I was going through. It didn't take away the hurt. I had to take away the hurt. I had to deal with what I was dealing with. And the first thing that I had to discover was why I was going through things the way that I was going. If you haven't heard this, you will hear it, where somebody said to me, you seem like you're okay, which means you can't be okay because nobody would be okay in this situation. And I wondered if there was truth to that. And I wondered so many things that people would say to me. My wife would say to me, you're not crying the way that I'm crying. Therefore, you could not have loved that child the way that you claim that you love that child. And I said, stop. I know in my heart, I know in my mind, I know in my soul that I love that child. So I need to figure out who I am and what I'm going through. And I did. And I was fortunate to somehow make contact with some amazing psychiatrists. Not only did they help me, but they took me under their wing. One of them allowed me to teach in his class. I don't say teach, let's just say guest lecture in his class, but he would disappear during the whole class. So I would tell him, you're allowing me to teach. But he would have young psychology students in his course that loved to just talk to me about what I experienced and what I was going through. And they had no idea that as they were asking me questions, they were helping me heal. And I looked at everything as a process to tell me that I'm okay. I had to look deep inside and realize I may not want to openly bawl in front of others. I may not want to say that I hurt, that I am someone who internalizes all of my emotions when I can. But I grieve for that child. I hurt for me. I hurt all over, and I do not like what's going on, but I am okay. And as you go through the book, sometimes I cry in the shower. It's literally just that. As we go through the epiphanies of discovering ourselves, and I do talk about both men and women. I had some amazing anthropologists where we studied basically the emotional expression of grief, whether it be from men and women. And we talk about gender, we talk about a number of things. It's so funny. We have to establish watermarks that even though there's 20% of everybody who might go into the gender of another, 80% of us are going to have some level of watermarks, even though we're all as unique as fingerprints and snowflakes. There are some things that are similarities. And as we look through this grief process, you'll notice in others as you gather in groups like this, some of the ones that are going through seemingly very, very similar processes to ours. And that'll make you feel a little better that you're not alone, that you're never alone. And as you take what we get from sometimes I cry in the shower, and you take from processing things as I did through my grief case, the bottom line to all of this is you're okay. You're unique. You're going to grieve in the way that you do, and you're going to reach out for help. And when you reach out for help, realize you're going to connect with those things that resonate within your heart and within your mind, and use those to help you move forward. If you were to change places, and we'll move on to some Q&As, but if you were to change places with that dear loved one that you lost, they'd want you to move on, healthy, emotionally, remembering them remembering you, letting life live in peace and purpose. So that's my story of John. He's with me every day. I talk to John. John hears me. I know he does. He enjoys listening to me. And I'll continue to talk to John. And I will continue to speak in front of such a great group as BFO as often as I'm invited back. And I feel it's an honor. So with that, I've taken quite a few minutes, and I apologize. I wanted to start out with my concept of the grief case, and I appreciate you allowing me to open my grief case up and show you John, because I'm at a point in my life now that grief case, it started out as something I would trip over, and something that I had to drag with me, and something that would keep me from going and living my life, is now something I've tossed a set of flip-flops and some suntan lotion in, and I take it with me to the beach, and I enjoy life. And when I open it and I take my things out to enjoy myself, I see John in it. And occasionally, I'll pull out that sadness folder and look at it and realize the deeper the hurt, the deeper the love. So can I answer any questions for anyone?
We have about 10 minutes for
I do go on, and I apologize.
No, you're actually right on time. If anybody has any questions, they can raise their hand, or they can just take themselves off mute and ask the questions. I just wanted to thank you, Ron, very much for speaking, and I love the analogy of the briefcase and the file folders. I'm kind of like an organized person, and I just like that where I try to organize my grief in file folders, but let me tell you, early in my grief, it didn't feel very organized at all. So
right?
I really like that
To
analogy.
me, it just made so much sense. And it came to my mind as I'm processing things, as I'm looking into my grief, because everyone can agree grief is not an emotion. Um, and we use that terminology ad nauseum. I know that, so and so is grieving and there's grief here and there's grief here. We just use that word. So grief is not what I'm going through. I mean, it's a package word for it. It's a container word for it. I'm going through anger. I'm going through fear. I'm going through regret. I'm not going through grief. You can call it what you want to. I'll use that to carry on those emotions with me as I go. And then I'll open up that grief case and I'll take a look at things and I'll process them.
Alain, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Jane, and thank you, Ron, for sharing. That was quite the story.
Thank you.
I was just curious. Of the two books you referenced, I actually bought both of them on the weekend. After I registered for tonight's session. But do you recommend reading one before the other?
No, sir. I mean, really, the grief case is really, yeah. Read Sometimes I Cry in the Shower first. I
All
would
right.
say that. I don't want to put one first. We're all unique. You could read Sometimes I Cry in the Shower, which was my progression through just discovering myself and my way of saying, hey, make sure you discover yourself as you go through this, because um, BFO is great. Our counselors are great. Nobody knows you more than you. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
as you read Sometimes I Cry in the Shower, and you read partially it's a story about me, but partially it's about that progression where I came to realize I'm me. Nobody else is me. I'm going to take advice for people and I'm going to absorb what really impacts me, but I can't go anywhere. I can't go through this unless I understand who I am first, right? So as you move
Mhm.
on to that and to the grief case, and of course that might be the best progression, is just to say, okay, now it really is time. Repressed grief is always going to get heavier. That grief case, until we open it up and look inside of it, it's just going to get heavier. And when you throw it around, the papers are going to get more jumbled. Grief is going to come out of that grief case. The emotions are going to spill out of that grief case one way or another. It's best to get into it as soon as you can.
Thank you.
And thank you for the
Okay.
honor of buying the books, and um, the honor truly is all mine for being here and being able to speak in front of you.
Well, thanks again.
Jenny.
Hi, Ron. Thank you very much for sharing your story and allowing us to get to know John a little bit through that. So I really
Thank you.
appreciate that. I've been lugging a grief case of my own around for many years, and I really resonated when you were talking about uncovering some false files. And I know that I have a few files that were false in my own case, and I was just curious. If you could share kind of how, was there a way that you were able to identify those files as not being accurate, or what you thought they might have been?
Yes, ma'am. I had, and I don't want anybody to think that, well, you can think what you want, but after John passed away, because he had a heart condition, is I went out and I had an attorney put together a group of pediatric cardiothoracic surgeons that were independent from that hospital. They didn't belong to that hospital. I was not going off a lawsuit. I was not going after a lawsuit. I wanted to know why John had passed away. The best thing that they could have ever said to me was, after all that we've looked at, it was John's time. And I went, wow, I've been carrying around anger for a long time. People that just 6 months ago were dear to me. And if you've ever been involved in a special needs child or a loved one that goes to see a doctor a lot, you begin to lean on them. You begin to trust them. You begin to look for their words of comfort. As that surgeon told me that John should live a full life with some interventions through there. So when John did not survive, my anger went towards those doctors and towards that hospital. I was actually later invited back to sit on a board at Le Bonheur Children's Hospital where my son passed away. And that is how I began to work with Le Bonheur. It was tough walking over that threshold, but it was easier walking over that threshold into that hospital, knowing that the anger that I had for them was false. The guilt is something that you're going to have to rectify yourself. You can understand that I felt guilty for allowing John to eat Cheetos from time to time. The kid had a bad heart. I will tell you this, that child had 16 years of the most loving childhood that any kid could have. And if I gave him a Cheeto, I'm okay with that. All right. I took away that guilt. That guilt doesn't need to be there. We could shoulda ourselves to death. It's the healthy part of the guilt. If there truly is something in there, and again, guilt is there to help you be a better person in the future. Sorry about what happened in the past, but it's there to help you be a better. If it's true, you will know it in your heart. If I can go back to the analogy, as you look at the things you're guilty of, as you open that folder and pull out a piece of paper that talks about you feel guilty because you didn't say I love you before your loved one passed, only you can know if that needs to be balled up and thrown away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. It's a great question.
Mario, do you have a question for Ron? You're on mute right now. I don't know if you can take yourself off mute.
I'm going to mute for a second, just do a throat clearing cough. I'm sorry.
There we go.
There you go.
Ron, thank you so much.
The honor's mine, sir. The honor's mine.
I was completely riveted the entire time. I was able to relate so much. My daughter was diagnosed at 16 months. She had 19 operations in her life, including a heart transplant. And yeah, when it happens, it's still as if you had no idea.
Right. Yes.
And
you hope to the very end.
And the part that I struggle with, that I related to the most, was about self-identity, having to do with self-identity. She was my only child, and thinking whether or not I'm still a father.
Right. How do you feel about that now?
Yeah, I'm still a father.
Good. Good.
Just
I got to be a United States Marine. One of the things that we know down here in the southern part of this wonderful continent that we live in is once a Marine, always Marine. And I took that away, as silly as that sounds. And I looked, I've lost both of my parents. And I am still the son of Don and Barbara Kelly. Nobody's ever questioned whether or not, just because they're gone, am I not still their child? They influenced me so much, and your daughter influenced you so much. That will never leave you. That fatherhood will never leave you.
It's been 14 years, Ron, and it wasn't until listening to you tonight that I was able to look inside me and realize, hey, I am still a father.
Hallelujah.
I have all that experience. I know what it is to be a father. I still have all those, and she's still waiting for me.
Yes, absolutely.
So
absolutely. And the key thing you said really was, I looked inside myself. There are many people that we are going to lean on, and we need to lean on other people sometimes, just as we need a crutch, just as we need a cast on a broken leg. But that leg has to heal itself with the help of others, if that makes sense. You said, I looked inside myself. There's so much healing inside. No one knows me better than me. My mom might debate that, but again, she's passed, so she's not here to debate that. But nobody knows me better than me. if I went to see the most renowned psychologist in the world, I would still walk away with what resonated with me. Does that make sense, Mario? Look inside, sir. You've done a wonderful thing. You are a father, and nobody can take that away from you. You
I
would
put it
still,
on, thank
to
you. I
this
put it on,
day, if I could get those 16 years and relive them again, knowing that it was going to end 16 years later, I would do it again.
absolutely.
Yes.
And, I put on a similar parallel that, when asked what was her name, um, well, it hasn't changed. It still is.
Yes. Yes. Still there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mario. And Damien, do you have a question or a comment?
Just a
Damon.
question, yeah. Thank you. I wanted to say thank you.
No, thank you.
Obviously, everything everyone has said, I echo. But your response about the guilt that I found very, very impactful. And the other thing you said during your speech, during your talk, sorry, you were referring to like your wife. You don't cry the same way as I do, and therefore you're not grieving enough. Or I'm finding a challenge in my life where, because I'm not in a box that someone thinks a box, and
Yes.
I'm just wondering like, how do you get around that?
You've got to get her involved. There's two sides to this. Okay. You are two different people. You probably were attracted to each other because you can do things that she can't. She can do things that you can't. That's what attracts us
right.
to that. That's the old opposites attract, but it truly is true. And you lean on her for things, she leans on things for you. The problem is we can be so diametrically opposed in the way that we process grief or that we process
Yes.
any trauma that when we go through this, and I'm not trying to be funny, she's sitting on the bed crying and you're staring at her like she's an alien because you've never seen this part of her. She's balled up and then completely can't be bothered. Leave her alone. She's going to cry, and you're out in the garage building bird cages. Okay. Because that's how you process your grief.
Right.
You have got to look at her, and I say this, be willing to put your face in the storm and listen to her. Okay.
Okay.
Because you need her to be willing to let you have your solitude, because you
Yeah.
are probably someone who wants to run off into a cave, because that's
Yep.
who we've been since the days of the Serengeti. Okay.
Yeah.
That's hard. That's the nature versus nurture part of us. Okay. You have things going on inside of your mind that tell you to do things subconsciously. Go build a bird cage. Get this thought out of your mind. Okay. We do. We're guys, we compartmentalize. We put everything in a box, right? And if you want to talk to me, I got to pull it out of that box. Women,
Yeah.
their brains are like the internet superhighway. Everything's connected. Okay. She's got to be willing to let you go in solitude from time to time. And brother, you got to be able to sit down on that couch and let her cry on your shoulder.
Yeah.
No matter how it makes you feel. There are so many people, and Jane was kind enough to talk about, I was on the board with Bereaved Parents of the USA. I did a number of years work with Compassionate Friends. So I've been to a number of conferences. I've met some of the most endearing people in my life that have lost a child, and they said their relationship was actually stronger after the loss. And like many of the gifts that we don't want, they would give it back and go back to being bickering, nasty people if they could have their child back. But one of the gifts was they were there for each other, knowing they had their differences. Do you get that?
Yeah, I hear you.
Look at her and know she's different. She's going to respond differently. This has been flipped on its side so much because I've met so many couples whose husbands are the ones who are despondent and in bed, balled up in a fetal position, crying, and the wife has to stay busy. It's just a matter of where you sit on your spectrum of it. But realize you're not the same people. And as you go through this and you look at her like, who is this alien that I married? I've never seen this part of her before. Comfort her and enjoy that, because it's the differences that will keep you both strong through this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Those are wise and wonderful parting words, Ron. Thank you
Oh,
so
parting
much.
words. Okay, I'm gone.
We got to get into our